It all began when Emily moved into the old Victorian house on the edge of town. She had inherited it from a distant relative she never met, and though the house was large and in need of repairs, she was excited to start fresh. The house came with all sorts of peculiar furniture and belongings left behind by the previous owners, but the one thing that caught Emily's eye most was an ornate, antique dollhouse in the attic. It was beautiful, crafted with delicate precision, with tiny rooms filled with miniature furniture, even smaller family portraits, and tiny dolls posed in each room. The dollhouse mirrored the Victorian house she now lived in, almost as if it had been made to reflect her home exactly. Every window, every door, even the wallpaper was the same. Emily brought the dollhouse down into the living room. As a child, she had always loved dollhouses, and this one felt like a treasure from the past. That night, as Emily sat reading by the fire, she heard a faint noise. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, a subtle creaking, as if someone was walking upstairs. She frowned. The house was old, surely it was just settling. But when she listened more closely, the sound seemed to mirror her own movements. When she stood up, the creaking stopped. When she walked to the kitchen, the noise resumed. Curious, Emily returned to the living room, her eyes drawn to the dollhouse. Something was different. The tiny figures inside had moved. She was sure of it. The dolls, which had been seated around the dining table earlier, were now standing, facing the door. She shook her head, thinking she must have bumped the dollhouse while cleaning. But as she reached out to adjust them back to their original positions, the front door of the real house creaked open slightly. Emily froze. She closed the door firmly, locking it this time. Her heart raced as she sat back down, glancing nervously at the dollhouse. The dolls were still now, but something felt wrong. The unease settled deep in her bones. Over the next few days, strange occurrences multiplied. Every time Emily checked the dollhouse, the dolls had shifted positions. Once, she found the tiny version of herself, a doll that eerily resembled her, lying on the floor as if it had fallen. In reality, that same day, Emily had tripped in the hallway, catching herself just before hitting the ground. Another time, the miniature kitchen was in disarray, with plates and cups scattered on the floor. That evening, Emily's cupboards had inexplicably fallen off the walls, sending her dishes crashing to the ground. The more she observed, the more she realized the dollhouse wasn't just a toy, it was a mirror of her own life. But worse, it seemed to predict what was going to happen before it did. And the things it predicted were becoming darker, more sinister. One night, she saw the tiny version of herself trapped in a corner of the dollhouse's bedroom, surrounded by the other dolls, their small, painted faces twisted into expressions of malice. Emily felt a sharp chill creep down her spine. She rushed upstairs to her own bedroom and found the door stuck as if something heavy was pressed against it from the other side. When she finally managed to push it open, she saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, was overwhelming. By now, Emily was terrified of the dollhouse, but she couldn't stop watching it. It felt like an obsession. Each morning, she checked to see what new horrors it would reveal, and each time her anxiety grew. The final straw came when she found the dollhouse in complete disarray, with the miniature version of herself lying on the floor in the attic, a small red mark on its head. That evening, as Emily stood in her real-life attic, a sharp pain suddenly struck her head. She fell to the floor, blood trickling down her forehead. Dazed, she looked around, her vision blurry. And then she saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the corner, watching her. The figure moved closer, and Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling down the stairs and locking herself in the living room. Trembling, she looked at the dollhouse again, only to see that the shadowy figure had now joined the dolls inside, standing over the miniature version of her lifeless body. Terrified and unsure of what to do, Emily decided she had to destroy the dollhouse. That night, she placed it in the fireplace, watching as the flames licked the sides of the tiny house. The wood crackled, and for a moment, she thought she could hear tiny screams, but she forced herself to ignore it. The flames consumed the dollhouse, but as it burned, the real house began to shake violently. Windows shattered, and doors slammed open and shut. The shadowy figure appeared once more, this time larger, more defined, its form twisting and writhing as it approached her. Emily backed into a corner, her heart racing as the figure loomed over her. The room was freezing now, and the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. She closed her eyes, waiting for the end. Months later, a young couple moved into the old Victorian house. They marveled at the spacious rooms, the old-fashioned charm, and the history the house seemed to hold. In the attic, they found something curious, a charred, broken dollhouse, barely recognizable. The woman smiled as she examined it. "This will be perfect once we restore it," she said, already imagining the new life they could give to the dollhouse. But as she reached down to pick up one of the small, blackened dolls, she could swear she felt it twitch in her hand.